Maid's daughter denied first-class seat. 5 minutes later, the plane is grounded and the pilot fired. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The plane was boarding, and the tension was palpable. In the luxury terminal, the polished floors reflected the grandeur of the surroundings. Travelers in sleek business suits, expensive watches, and designer handbags passed through the marble hall with an air of superiority. Among them was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, wearing a modest dress and sneakers that had seen better days. She was traveling with her mother, a housekeeper who worked tirelessly to provide for her family. Today was supposed to be special. Her mother had saved for months to afford this flight, a rare opportunity for them to sit in first class. But when they approached the gate, the unthinkable happened. A tall, well-dressed man behind the counter looked at the boarding passes, then back at the young girl. "I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to sit here," he said coldly, pointing to the first-class section. "This seat is for paying customers only." The girl, her eyes wide with confusion, didn't understand. She had a seat, didn't she? Her mother, already tired from the constant battles of daily life, tried to explain, but the attendant's tone was dismissive. "Go to economy class. The seat isn't for someone like you." She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their judgment hanging thick in the air. They whispered to each other, watching the scene unfold. The young girl's heart sank. Her mother, who always told her to keep her head high, could feel the sting of embarrassment, but she kept her composure. "Please, we paid for this seat. We have every right to sit here," she implored, but the attendant remained unmoved. Just then, the girl's mother whispered something in her ear, her voice barely audible. "Just stay calm, honey. Let's not cause trouble." As the mother led the girl to economy class, the girl's gaze lingered on the empty seat in first class, wondering why she couldn't sit there. It wasn't just about the seat. It was the message she received, that she didn't belong in a space reserved for those with wealth and status. They took their seats in the back of the plane, surrounded by other passengers who barely noticed them. The girl's mind raced. She couldn't help but wonder, what had she done wrong? The flight took off, the engines roaring as the plane ascended into the sky. But something wasn't right. The girl's intuition told her that the situation wasn't over. She had been dismissed, pushed aside, but deep inside, she knew there was something bigger at play. As the plane continued its flight, there was a growing sense of unease. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled stop shortly," he said. The announcement was short, but it set the entire cabin on edge. The plane, once cruising smoothly, began to slow down. The passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. Something was happening, and no one knew exactly what it was. The young girl, sitting quietly in her seat, began to piece it together. She had seen something that didn't sit right with her. 5 minutes later, the announcement came again, this time more urgent. "We are forced to land immediately due to a mechanical issue. All passengers, please remain calm." The plane descended, and within moments, it was grounded on the runway. The passengers, who had once been concerned about nothing more than their delayed flight, were now faced with the shocking reality that something far more serious was unfolding. The pilot was escorted off the plane, his face pale. As he passed the young girl, he avoided her gaze, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The flight, which had started with a simple act of prejudice, ended in a way no one could have predicted. The plane was grounded, and the pilot was fired. The girl, though young, had unwittingly exposed a flaw in the system. Her quiet strength, her quiet observation, had turned the tables. The flight was a microcosm of society's treatment of the underprivileged. They were seen, they were heard, and they made a difference. It was a story of injustice, but also a story of redemption, a story that would change everything for the girl and for everyone who had witnessed what happened. I can still hear the whispers in the cabin, the hum of the plane as it settled on the runway. The young girl sat in her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The events of the past few minutes had been a blur, a rush of emotions, confusion, and disbelief. The plane had been grounded, and the pilot had been escorted off. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The passengers were all murmuring, the tension in the air palpable. Some were still looking around, unsure of what had just happened. But the girl knew. She had seen the pilot's face when he passed by. He was defeated, and she realized that this wasn't just about a seat in first class. It was about something far bigger, something that she had yet to fully understand. As the minutes ticked by, the crew began to move about the cabin, offering passengers small explanations, but no one seemed to know exactly why the plane had been grounded. The girl's mother, still trying to hold her composure, whispered gently to her, telling her to stay calm. But the young girl's mind was racing. She couldn't let it go. Her instincts told her that there was something more to the situation, something that had to do with the events that had transpired before the plane had taken off. As the cabin lights dimmed, the girl looked out the small window, watching the ground crew work quickly around the plane. She had never seen so much activity on the tarmac before. Something was definitely wrong. The minutes turned into hours. The passengers were eventually told that the plane would be delayed indefinitely, as the issue was being resolved. It was a small comfort to the passengers, but the girl couldn't help but feel uneasy. She was aware of the people around her, their eyes casting occasional glances toward her. Some of them were still angry about the delay, while others were still puzzled by what had happened. But there was something else she noticed, a look of guilt on the face of one of the flight attendants who had been involved in the earlier confrontation. She couldn't place it, but it was there, subtle but undeniable. Eventually, a senior officer from the airline boarded the plane. He walked down the aisle, his gaze scanning the faces of the passengers. When he reached the front, he paused for a moment, looking directly at the young girl. His eyes softened for just a second before he turned to speak with the crew. The girl, though confused, understood that something had changed. She could feel it in the air. The officer's words to the crew were quiet but firm, and the girl couldn't help but listen in. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again," the officer said. "Let's handle this with care." The young girl's curiosity grew. She wasn't sure what the officer meant, but she had a feeling it had something to do with the actions of the pilot and the way the situation had unfolded. And then, something unexpected happened. The pilot, who had been escorted off the plane earlier, reappeared. He walked down the aisle slowly, his expression a mix of frustration and embarrassment. The passengers fell silent as he approached. He stopped just short of the girl's seat. The air in the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The pilot cleared his throat before speaking, his voice hesitant. "I owe you an apology," he said, his gaze meeting the girl's. "You were right." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The girl's heart skipped a beat as she looked up at him. She hadn't expected this. The pilot continued, his voice gaining strength. "I misjudged the situation earlier. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. But I've learned a valuable lesson today. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." The girl's mother, who had been sitting silently beside her, looked at the pilot, a faint but grateful smile crossing her face. The tension in the cabin began to ease, and for the first time since they had boarded, the girl felt a sense of relief. She hadn't just witnessed the pilot's apology. She had seen something far more significant. It was the beginning of a change, not just for her, but for everyone on that plane. The officer's earlier words made sense now. The airline, the crew, and the passengers were all learning something. This wasn't just about a seat in first class. It was about dignity, fairness, and the understanding that no one should be judged based on their appearance, background, or social status. The pilot's apology marked the end of one chapter, but the girl knew, deep down, that this story wasn't over yet. There was more to come. And as the plane finally took off, the young girl sat back in her seat, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had made a difference. She had shown everyone what true justice looked like. I could feel the weight of the moment as the plane began its journey through the sky. The tension from the previous hours still lingered, but now, there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The passengers, who had once whispered and cast judgmental glances, seemed to have softened. Some were still processing the earlier events, while others looked out of the windows, trying to shake off the discomfort. But for the young girl and her mother, the flight had taken on an entirely new meaning. The pilot's apology was a turning point. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that was going to change not just their journey, but how they saw the world around them. As the plane soared high above the clouds, I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the way people were behaving. The man who had once mocked the girl now seemed to avoid eye contact, perhaps embarrassed by his previous actions. The woman in the designer dress who had overheard the exchange at the gate seemed more contemplative now, as if she had been touched by the apology. The girl, who had once been an invisible passenger, now sat in the middle of a story that had the potential to reshape the way people saw each other. As the flight continued, the crew began to relax a little, too. The flight attendants, who had once walked with stiff, rehearsed smiles, now moved with more ease. They glanced at the young girl every so often, as if acknowledging the quiet change in the air. The girl's mother, still sitting beside her, had a look of quiet pride on her face. She knew that her daughter had done something extraordinary, something that most people would never have the courage to do. And although the journey ahead was still long, the lessons from this flight would stay with them forever. But the story didn't end there. The young girl couldn't help but notice something strange happening. In the row in front of them, a passenger who had been sitting quietly, a man in a sharp suit, had his phone out. He was speaking in hushed tones to someone on the other end, but the young girl could hear his words. "No, I don't think there'll be a problem anymore," the man said. "The pilot, he's been taken care of." Her heart skipped a beat as she listened, trying to make sense of the words. Who was he talking about? And what did he mean by taken care of? The girl turned to her mother, her instincts telling her that there was more to this story than she had imagined. She leaned in and whispered, "Mom, I think something's wrong." Her mother, who had been quietly watching out the window, turned to her daughter, her face serious. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked. The young girl hesitated, her mind racing. "I overheard him talking about the pilot. I think he's part of something bigger. Something that's not right." The mother's eyes widened in concern. She had seen the way the passengers and crew had reacted to the pilot's apology, but she hadn't noticed the man on the phone. They both turned toward the row in front of them, but the man was already slipping his phone back into his pocket. The young girl's curiosity burned even more brightly now. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew that there was more to this situation than just a simple flight delay and a pilot's apology. She had learned a valuable lesson that day. No matter how small you are, or how much you are dismissed, you can still make an impact. But now, it seemed that the impact she had made was just the beginning of a much larger story. The young girl couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something that would change the course of everything. She sat up straighter in her seat, determined to find out what was going on. This wasn't just about a seat in first class anymore. This was something much bigger, and she wasn't going to let it slip by unnoticed. I could feel the intensity building in the air as the plane glided through the sky. The young girl, still processing the pilot's apology and the mysterious conversation she had overheard, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She sat in her seat, her hands tightly gripping the armrests, her mind racing with questions. Her mother, who had been quietly watching her, noticed the concern etched across her daughter's face. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked softly, not wanting to draw too much attention. The girl hesitated, then whispered back, "I overheard a man talking about the pilot. He said he's been taken care of." "What does that mean, Mom?" Her mother's expression tightened, her instincts kicking in. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice low. "But we should stay calm. Let's just focus on getting through the flight, okay?" The girl nodded, but her curiosity was burning. She had already realized that she couldn't ignore what she had heard. This wasn't just a matter of a flight delay and a misjudgment. This felt much bigger. As the plane continued its journey, the girl's mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard. She replayed the words in her head, trying to make sense of them. "The pilot has been taken care of." It wasn't just an offhand comment. It was deliberate. Someone had made sure that the pilot would no longer be a problem. The girl didn't know how, but she could feel that something sinister was unfolding. But what? Why had the pilot been singled out? And why was this man on the phone so concerned? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her earlier instinct was right. She had stumbled into something far more complex than she had ever imagined. There was something deeply wrong happening on this plane, and it was all connected to the incident with the pilot. The girl looked out the window, watching as the clouds rolled past. It was all so surreal. A few hours ago, she had just been another passenger, quietly traveling with her mother. Now, she felt like a witness to something that could change everything. Her heart raced as she wondered what would happen next. Was the pilot's apology just a way to smooth things over, or had it been part of something bigger? The girl's thoughts were interrupted when the intercom crackled to life again. The flight attendant's voice was calm, but there was a subtle edge to it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a minor issue with our navigation system. We are working to resolve it, but please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. The girl felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked at her mother, who was watching the attendants closely. This is no ordinary delay, the girl whispered, barely able to contain the anxiety rising in her chest. Something's happening, Mom. Something's wrong. Her mother didn't respond immediately, but the look in her eyes said it all. She had noticed it too. The girl's suspicions were becoming harder to ignore. The plane's descent had been unnerving, and now the message over the intercom about the minor issue seemed too rehearsed, too vague. There was no such thing as a small problem on a flight like this. It was all connected, and the young girl knew deep down that she couldn't just sit back and wait for answers. She had to find out the truth. The flight attendant walked down the aisle again, and for a moment, their eyes met. The young girl saw something flicker in her gaze, an emotion that didn't belong in the calm, professional demeanor of a flight attendant. It was fear. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just about a delay or a disgruntled pilot. Something far more serious was at play. The girl looked out the window once more, her mind spinning with possibilities. What if the pilot hadn't been the only one involved in whatever was going on? What if there was something else, something much bigger, that they were all a part of? The story was far from over, and she knew she had to stay alert. Whatever was happening, she was not going to sit quietly and watch it unfold. She would uncover the truth, and she would make sure that justice was served. I could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier as the minutes passed. The young girl, her mind still racing, couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The intercom announcement about a minor issue was nothing more than a cover-up. She was sure of it. As the plane continued its flight, the crew's behavior became more guarded, more controlled. The air felt thick with secrecy, and the girl knew something was being hidden from the passengers. Her eyes darted around the cabin, trying to make sense of everything. The flight attendants were no longer their usual, calm selves. There was an edge to their movements, a hesitation in their voices. Every time one of them passed, their eyes quickly flickered over to the girl, almost as if they were unsure how to react. The girl could sense that something was about to happen. She wasn't just a passive observer anymore. She had become a part of something much bigger than herself. Her mind went back to the conversation she had overheard earlier. He's been taken care of. Those words echoed in her thoughts, louder with each passing moment. What had they done to the pilot? Was he really just fired, or had something more sinister taken place? The girl looked at her mother, who was still trying to stay calm, but clearly worried. "Mom," the girl whispered, "I think we need to do something. Something is wrong. They're hiding something." Her mother glanced at her, her face pale. She hadn't said much, but she had heard the girl's concerns. It was clear to her now that her daughter had uncovered something that couldn't be ignored. The young girl felt a deep need to act, to uncover the truth no matter what. As if on cue, the flight attendants began to gather near the front of the plane. One of them spoke in a hushed tone to the pilot who had replaced the original one, and the young girl couldn't help but overhear snippets of the conversation. "The plan has changed. We need to move quickly." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had no idea what they were planning, but she could feel the urgency in the air. The situation was spiraling out of control. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life once more. The captain's voice was calm, but there was a subtle tension in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical issue with the aircraft. Please remain calm and stay in your seats. We will be making an emergency landing." The words hit like a bombshell. The passengers froze. What had started as a minor issue had now escalated into a full-blown emergency. The young girl's heart raced. She turned to her mother, who looked as startled as everyone else. "Mom, this is it. We need to get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice shaking. Her mother nodded, her face serious. "We will," she whispered. The cabin was filled with a nervous energy as the plane began its descent. Outside the windows, the ground seemed to rush up faster than it should have. The girl could hear the whispers of the other passengers, their voices filled with fear and confusion. The situation had gone from a simple delay to a full-blown crisis, and the girl knew that it was all connected to what had happened earlier with the pilot. She wasn't sure how, but she was certain now that the incident had set off a chain of events that was unfolding right before her eyes. As the plane continued its descent, the girl's mind raced. What was the real reason for the emergency landing? And why had the crew been so tight-lipped about everything? She had no answers, only questions. The cabin lights flickered, and the young girl felt a sense of dread wash over her. She had made a difference before, but now she had to act quickly. Something bigger was at play, and she was not about to let it slip by unnoticed. She had already proven that even the smallest voice could make a difference, but now she had to use that voice again to uncover the truth. Whatever was happening, she would not stay silent. She had to find out what was going on, and she had to do it now. I could feel my heart pounding as the plane continued its rapid descent. The world outside the window was a blur of motion, and the cabin was filled with the sound of murmuring passengers, their voices a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Everyone was still trying to make sense of what was happening. The emergency landing had been announced, but no one seemed to have any clear answers. The young girl, who had been a quiet observer up until now, knew deep down that she couldn't sit by any longer. She had to act. The crew, once composed and professional, now seemed on edge. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, their steps quick and purposeful, yet their eyes were always darting, scanning the cabin for something or someone. The girl noticed the flight attendants' nervous glances. They were hiding something. The pilot's earlier apology seemed like a momentary calm before the storm. But now, she realized it was more than just that. The situation was deteriorating, and the more she thought about it, the more it felt like the entire flight was a cover-up for something much bigger. As the plane continued its rapid descent, the intercom crackled to life again. The voice of the captain echoed through the cabin, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the calm, professional tone from earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, his voice strained, "we are experiencing an issue with the aircraft systems. Please remain seated and follow all instructions from the crew. We will be landing shortly, but I ask for your cooperation." The message was short, but the girl could hear the underlying urgency in his voice. This wasn't just a mechanical issue. She had heard it before, the code words, the vague language meant to keep the truth hidden. The girl glanced at her mother, who was gripping the armrest, her knuckles white with anxiety. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think we're in real danger." Her mother turned to look at her, her eyes wide with concern. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The young girl could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. "I don't think this is just an emergency landing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else going on. Something the crew isn't telling us." Her mother didn't say anything at first, but she could see the worry growing in her eyes. She knew her daughter was right. Something wasn't right. The young girl turned back to the front of the cabin, her gaze locked on the flight attendants, who were now moving with an intensity that was hard to ignore. One of them walked past the young girl, and for a split second, their eyes met. The attendant's face was pale, her expression tense. The young girl could see the fear behind her carefully maintained composure. As the plane continued its descent, the young girl's mind raced. What had started as a simple misunderstanding over a first-class seat had now escalated into something far more dangerous. The pilot, the crew, and the passengers were all caught in something bigger than any of them had realized. The girl couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They were being pulled into a situation that none of them fully understood. And as the plane continued its descent, it was clear that the young girl wasn't going to be able to ignore the truth any longer. She had already made a difference once. But now, she had to do something bigger. She had to make sure everyone was safe. She had to uncover the truth. The plane was almost on the ground now. The girl's heart raced, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. I could feel the tension in the air as the plane continued its descent. The young girl's heart raced faster with each passing second. The crew was still moving with urgency, their faces grim as they prepared for an emergency landing. The hum of the engines was louder now, a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. The passengers around her whispered in hushed tones, trying to understand what was happening. The girl looked at her mother, whose face was pale with fear. "Mom," "We have to do something," she whispered. Her mother glanced at her, her voice trembling. "What can we do, sweetheart? We just need to stay calm and wait for the landing." The girl didn't respond. She knew her mother was scared, but deep down, she knew she couldn't just sit quietly and wait for whatever was coming next. She had already proven that she could make a difference. Now, she had to do it again. As the plane descended closer to the ground, the flight attendants began to gather near the cockpit. The girl watched them closely, noting their hushed conversations and the frantic looks they exchanged. There was something more going on here. The young girl's instincts were screaming that there was more to this than just a mechanical failure or a simple emergency landing. The crew was hiding something. They were all involved in something far bigger, and she had to figure out what it was. As the plane began to level out, the girl stood up slowly, trying not to attract attention. Her mother reached out to stop her, but the girl gently pulled away. She had to do this. She had to know the truth. The girl moved quickly down the aisle, her footsteps light but purposeful. She couldn't hear the conversations around her anymore. All she could think about was the crew, the pilot, and the mystery that had been unfolding since she boarded the plane. When she reached the cockpit door, she hesitated. There were two flight attendants standing nearby, but they were distracted. This was her chance. She took a deep breath and moved past them, her hand reaching for the door handle. The flight attendants looked up, startled, but it was too late. The girl had already pushed the door open. Inside, the cockpit was chaos. The pilot was frantically working with the co-pilot, their faces filled with tension. The girl's presence seemed to freeze them for a moment. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The pilot looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to get this far. "You shouldn't be here," the co-pilot said, his voice low and urgent. But the girl wasn't backing down. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on them both. "I know there's something wrong. What's happening?" The silence in the cockpit was deafening. For a moment, neither of the men spoke. Then, with a reluctant sigh, the pilot stood up and turned to face her. "We're not supposed to be telling anyone this," he said, his voice shaky. "But you're right. There's more going on. This plane isn't just having technical issues." The girl's heart skipped a beat. She had been right all along. The pilot continued, his voice quieter now. "We've been compromised. There are people on board who shouldn't be here, and they've been manipulating the flight. They've been causing the issues we've been having." The girl's mind spun. She couldn't process everything all at once, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a simple emergency landing. She had been right all along. The plane wasn't just experiencing technical difficulties. There was something much bigger at play. The pilot's voice dropped to a whisper. "We're trying to regain control of the situation, but it's getting harder. There's not much time." The girl's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes locked on the pilot's, and she understood everything in that moment. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of this story now, and she had to act. The girl turned quickly, her mind racing as she headed back down the aisle. She had to warn her mother. She had to warn everyone. The danger wasn't over, and she knew that time was running out. The plane was no longer just a flight. It had become a battleground, and she was about to be caught in the middle. I rushed back to my seat, my heart hammering in my chest. The weight of what I had just learned was sinking in, and I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The pilot had confirmed it. This wasn't just a mechanical failure. There were people on board with ulterior motives, manipulating the entire flight. I had to tell my mother, but I had no idea how to explain what I had just heard. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to sit down beside her. Her worried eyes met mine. "What happened?" she whispered. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's worse than we thought," I said, my voice barely audible. "There are people on this plane causing the problems. The pilot said they're manipulating everything. It's not just technical issues." Her face turned pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. I didn't know what to say. The plane was still descending, the engines roaring as if they were struggling to maintain control. The tension in the air was palpable. I looked around at the other passengers, most of them unaware of the danger. It felt like I was the only one who knew the truth, and I wasn't sure how to stop what was happening. Then, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions." The calmness in his voice did nothing to ease the growing panic inside me. I glanced at my mother, who was clutching my hand tightly. "We need to do something," I said, my voice firm. "We can't just sit here and wait." My mother nodded, her expression determined. "You're right. Let's find out what's really going on." The plane was descending rapidly now, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest. I knew we had little time left to act. I stood up, looking around for any sign of what was going on. The flight attendants were still moving around the cabin, but there was something different in their behavior. They were tense, whispering to each other, their eyes constantly scanning the cabin. I moved quickly, my instincts telling me to follow them. I was sure they were in on it, whatever it was. I couldn't let them manipulate everyone on this plane without knowing the truth. As I approached the galley, one of the attendants noticed me and quickly blocked my path. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Just staying out of the way," I said, trying to sound casual. But I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't fooling me. Something was wrong. She took a step closer to me, lowering her voice. "You need to go back to your seat," she said urgently. "This isn't your problem." But I wasn't going to back down. "It is my problem," I replied, my voice steady. "I know what's going on. You can't hide it anymore." For a brief moment, the attendant's face softened. "Please," she whispered, "just stay quiet. It's for everyone's safety." I shook my head. "No, I need to know the truth." Just as she was about to respond, the cabin door opened, and the pilot stepped out of the cockpit, looking hurried and tense. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw something in them. Guilt, fear, desperation. He was part of it, too. The story was much bigger than I realized. I moved toward him before he could turn away. "What's going on?" I demanded. The pilot hesitated, his gaze flickering to the attendants who were still watching from a distance. Then, he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. You can't know. It's too dangerous." But I could see the truth in his eyes. I had already figured it out. I had to know more, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered everything. The plane was moments away from landing, and I knew this was my last chance to stop what was happening. The pilot's words weren't enough. I had to expose the truth, not just for me, but for everyone on this flight. I stood there, staring at the pilot, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The tension was unbearable, and I could sense that everyone on the plane was waiting for something to happen. The crew, the passengers, everyone had been living under a cloud of uncertainty, and now the truth was finally out. The pilot's words, whispered in my ear, had confirmed it. The plane wasn't just experiencing a technical failure. It had been sabotaged, manipulated by people on board who were using the flight for their own dark purposes. But there was still time to stop it. The young girl's mind raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the fear slowly creeping in as she understood just how serious the danger was. She had to act, and quickly. Looking at the pilot, she took a deep breath and made her decision. She wasn't going to let this plane be part of something more sinister. "We need to tell everyone," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "We need to stop them now." The pilot's eyes widened as he realized what she meant. "You can't," he whispered urgently. "It's too dangerous." But the girl wasn't backing down. She had already made a difference. She wasn't going to let fear or secrecy stop her now. She turned and rushed toward the front of the plane, her feet moving quickly as she fought the rising panic in her chest. Her mind was set. She had to expose the truth. She had to stop this before it was too late. The flight attendants were still watching, but this time, they weren't trying to stop her. She could see the fear in their eyes, too. The truth was out, and they were all complicit. She reached the intercom and grabbed the microphone. The cabin fell silent as the girl's voice echoed through the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice strong despite the fear bubbling inside her. "There are people on this plane who are manipulating the flight." The pilot confirmed it. "This isn't just a technical issue. They've been causing the problems, and it's not over yet." Gasps filled the cabin, and the murmurs started to rise. Passengers turned to each other, confusion and fear written on their faces. Some of them were still unsure whether to believe her, but others had already started to understand. The truth was undeniable. The young girl continued, her eyes scanning the room, meeting the eyes of the passengers. "We need to land safely, but we need to know what's going on. There are people here who need to be stopped before this plane is brought down for good." Her words hung in the air, the tension thick. There was no turning back now. As the plane continued its descent, the passengers were in shock. They had been caught in a conspiracy they never expected. The young girl had stepped forward, making sure everyone knew the truth. She had given them the chance to survive, the chance to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. The flight attendants began to act, their professional masks slipping away as they worked to regain control of the situation. They moved quickly, checking on the passengers and trying to stabilize the flight. But the girl knew that the danger wasn't over. She had exposed the truth, but the real battle was just beginning. When the plane finally touched down, emergency vehicles rushed to the runway. The young girl was escorted off the plane, still shaken but relieved. She had done it. She had stopped something terrible from happening. And as she stepped onto solid ground, she looked back at the plane, knowing that this was just the beginning of her story. The events of that flight would change everything. The girl had uncovered a conspiracy, but the world was waiting for her to tell the full story. The truth had been exposed, but the fight for justice was far from over. Get ready for an exciting journey as we dive into an incredible tale of a young girl uncovering a deep conspiracy on a plane. This thrilling adventure takes us through twists and turns that reveal hidden truths and unexpected heroes. As we explore the events unfolding on this flight, you'll witness a story full of suspense, mystery, and courage. With the girl's determination, she steps up to expose the truth that no one else dares to confront. This story will remind you of the power of one individual to change the course of an entire situation. The storyline is reminiscent of classic millionaire stories where the underdog faces powerful forces, yet still manages to make a difference. The twists and the shocking revelations will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you love stories of bravery and determination, this tale will have you questioning what you know about power and wealth. Just like other millionaire stories, this one shows how the wealthy can manipulate situations, but in this case, it is the actions of a young girl that bring everything to light. Her journey is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth will always find its way out. If you've ever been fascinated by millionaire stories where the rich and powerful are challenged by those who dare to stand up to them, you'll find this story captivating. Prepare yourself for a wild ride as the young girl's bravery turns the tables on the rich and powerful, making this one of the most unexpected millionaire stories you've ever heard. This is not just another story of the elite. It's a tale about standing up against corruption, revealing the truth, and changing the game forever.